All right. Thank you, Jordan, and welcome to everyone who's joined us. We're looking forward to a really interactive webinar today, and it's my real pleasure to introduce both of our guests that are going to be on here, and we're going to hear quite a bit from them. We want this to be like a discussion, an interview flow, and so we're particularly excited about what's ahead for the next hour and a half. Let me just say this before we get started. This is the webinar series of the Zehr Institute under the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. Our topic for today, Youth Leadership for Restorative Justice. And I'm particularly excited about this because the guests we have on are folks who've been working with youth organizing and youth leadership in the restorative justice movement, as you've been hearing us call this for some time. And we want to find out some of the inner workings of that incredible work and the accomplishments that are happening there. Johonna Turner is the newest faculty member here at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. She comes out of the field having worked with youth in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area. Her expertise is in youth activism and organizing. She's helped to set up youth organizations. She was a Soros Fellow working with youth and arts and using the arts in processes of advocacy and peace building. She has a critical theory lens as she looks at prison studies, arts, culture, and social change, with a background in journalism, which is critical to her work around framing and narrative. She has a number of graduate certificates in women's studies, and she did her PhD work from the University of Maryland, and she's also involved with urban youth ministry. She just came out of a certificate process there with Fuller Theological Seminary in the West Coast. So part of having Johonna on, she's been on a number of other webinars already, is to bring her into the conversation more and to introduce her to you folks. You'll be seeing more of her as she engages with the Zehr Institute and with our work here at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. She has about 15 years working in arts collectives, community organizing, and social movement work, especially with youth and also with marginalized communities. She's an advocate of both restorative and transformative justice approaches, and she collaborated with local youth, teenagers to be exact, to produce a video as a product out of her Soros Justice Fellow work called Vision is Our Power. This is a documentary film made for youth, talking about how to end violence, gun violence, dating violence, and police violence. Powerful tool and a powerful instrument, and welcome anyone who'd like to see that and have a copy of that. Jonathan Stith, founding member of the National Coordinator for the Alliance for Educational Justice. This is an incredible alliance. Prior to this, Jonathan was former director of the youth organizing at Empower in DC. He spent 18 years of experience working with youth and community organizations to address a broad range of social inequities. And as the executive director of the Youth Education Alliance, he is a critical leader in sort of the school modernization campaign and what it means. But some of the successes and the wins that he's seen with the alliance of partners who are organizing here, one of the most notable is winning $3.2 billion for school renovation and repair in the district. He's on the steering committee of the Justice for DC Youth Coalition. He's a certified trainer in advancing youth development for Children Youth Investment Trust, other youth leadership and institute programs. Founder of Pump Your Fist, a youth activist and organizing training institute that supports the development of youth-led social change across this country. And last, and very importantly, he's the father of and that's just cool all the way around. So we're going to look forward to the conversation with both of our guests, and welcome, Jonathan and Johonna.
Thank you.
So maybe to just get us started, Jonathan, I'm gonna just leave it open, pretty open-ended, but talk to us about the Alliance for Educational Justice. I'm not sure how many folks out in the audience have heard about this. So tell us about it, how it came together, and a little bit about youth leadership and its connection to the restorative justice movement.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you all for having me on to really talk about this work and to really highlight the incredible work that young people are doing all across the country. The Alliance for Educational Justice was started in 2008. It was the coming together of about 19 youth organizing groups who, for about 10, 20 years, depending on the age of the group, have been really working in their communities, leading youth-led education campaigns to really figure out how they improve and transform public education. We came together nationally under what we saw as an opportunity for around ESEA, and a lot of the conversation at the time was when we would go for wins like federal legislation seemed to always be in the room, and so we saw it as a real opportunity to come together to also build what we saw was needed, which was a national movement to really dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. And for a lot of the groups, that's centered around changing school discipline codes, also looking at funding inequity, facility repair, kind of all the things that go into making great schools great, and making sure that young people, particularly young people in communities of color and impoverished communities, got their share. So we're about 29 groups from across the country who joined the Alliance and are currently, again, part of our vision, or young people's vision, around what next after we dismantle the prison pipeline, the conversation around justice. And so as we go on, we'll talk about young people, not only about winning policy, but also being knowledge producers and how they're taken restorative to education and come out with some really innovative programs and approaches to addressing school discipline.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm gonna keep probing, because I think the description of what you're doing is really important. So talk to me a little bit about the factors that have shaped, or maybe your vision and your sense of young people's leadership in this movement. What does that really mean? How are the young people really taking the lead in this movement? How does that work, and how did you make that, not you, but how has that happened in the processes that you used?
I mean, one, young people are most directly affected by education, particularly the young people that we work with are high school students. And so for many of them, high school is that springboard, that last transition into adulthood. And kind of what they understand is that the trajectory that they set coming out of high school has a deep impact on their trajectory into adulthood. And so for them, leadership looks like a variety of things. Again, we have young people who are, organizing every day after school, after going to school all day, after school, around trying to get their city to fund restorative justice programs. In New York, we had young people actually create and pilot a restorative justice program. Also, in addition to that, looking at some of the factors for young people, they see restorative justice not just as the practice of what happens when two students harm each other in an act of intercommunal violence, but kind of the entire school system and the structures that go in there. And then how do you really create restorative justice climates in schools? And that begins to widen the lens to look at funding equity, what gets staff in the school, how many cops versus guidance counselors do they get. So young people are doing budget analysis. They're making budget recommendations. They're testifying before city council. Some of them are traveling to Washington, D.C., meeting with Department of Eds. They're protesting, sitting in, dining in. But most of it is really trying to get out and educate other young folk and other teachers and community members really around a different approach. Like there is another way to address school discipline that doesn't lead to being punished and pushed out.
That's great. I love it, because what I'm imagining right now, there's probably some folks that have joined the webinar who are trying to figure out what restorative justice means to this youth movement. And there's probably folks in the youth movement who have no idea what restorative justice means to certain professionals out there who are doing a particular slice of it. And so I'm really happy you brought in this sense of how do the youth and this organizing see restorative justice? As you've already mentioned a bit about, it's beyond the interpersonal harm,
Right.
and they're seeing it as something that can actually affect structurally. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Any examples of how that comes about? How you're training them?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. For young people, like the mode of school discipline has been zero tolerance, right? You make one mistake and you're out of here. You make one mistake, or things that would have been handled by the school dean are now handled by the school police, or community police. And so young people really see restorative justice as the antithesis to zero tolerance. And when you ask them what do they want, and they also see it in line with a philosophy of education that they believe is transformative, and they see restorative justice as a transformative means to address discipline, but to also address some of the structural inequalities that can exacerbate intercommunal violence between young folk. You got overcrowded classrooms. They see restorative justice as more teachers in their schools so that classes won't be overcrowded. They see restorative justice as making sure that there's enough AP classes available for students. They see restorative justice really in funding equity and keeping their schools open. I think the most recent case where we would draw some attention to would be the case of South Carolina, what happened in Columbia. And for us, we imagine restorative justice would have been the answer to that particular situation, that instead of calling the police, we imagine maybe there was a restorative justice coordinator who would have came and helped de-escalate and to get to the source of the root of what was happening in the conflict, and really work on the relationship between the student and teacher, the student and teacher in the class, and really create some peace and justice rather than the kind of conflict and tension that we saw come out of that particular incident.
Beautiful. I mean, in that incident, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, there could have been a whole set of places where this could have been arrested earlier, excuse the word, prevented earlier. Like even the teacher being able to manage that discussion in the classroom to find out what's happening with their individual students in their class. What are they going through? What are they bringing from home or the community that's stressing them or de-stressing them and traumatizing them? And how might that be connected to the behavior they're bringing into the classroom? I mean, it was difficult to watch folks, adults and others, standing back without seeming to know what to do other than to call the police into that situation. But what I really like about what you're saying is, it seems to me, and help me if I'm going into places that aren't right, but there's a lot of intersectionality here. In other words, these youth are organizing, understanding that we're talking about our own way in which we relate interpersonally amongst each other in the school, but we're also very aware that this has impact in our education, this has impact in the community, this has impact with the police and the courts, and potentially with our families, I guess. Is that the kind of way in which you want to see that sort of holistic, global sort of sense of restorative justice for the youth?
Yeah, I think so. When I talk to young folk, my sense is not so much that they are organizing to transform a school, but that's the most concrete. But really, when they're organizing to change education, they're really trying to change society. And they understand really deeply in how Nelson Mandela talked about, like, if you want to change the world, you change it through education. And I think they see that fight around planting restorative justice in schools is about planting it in schools grows it in society. And they see, really, again, education as a transformative quality that will advance our country. And they see restorative justice as a means to that. And I think it has implications to larger issues, particularly in a moment, a Black Lives Matter moment, right? When we're struggling with what it means for criminal justice and mass incarceration in this country. Young people in schools, their answer is restorative justice.
Beautiful. Maybe you want to add a little bit. There's some words we're throwing around maybe that folks are still wrestling with. We've been talking about youth organizing, and I'd love for you to comment a little bit more on broadly youth organizing and the vision behind that, if you want to say some more on that. One word we haven't been using, but I'd like to introduce, because I know you use it and others use it, and that is intergenerational organizing. Maybe you could give us a little bit of sense of what are those terms and how are you using them?
Right. So youth organizing usually involves young people kind of coming together to build a base of folk to organize, to create power, to be able to change policy and relationships in a real tangible way. And then for us, intergenerational include, that's when they allow old fogies like me in the room. But oftentimes includes parent groups who are doing some organizing around policy change or institutional practice. And a lot of groups are intergenerational in the sense because, one, we just understand that young folk have very little economic, social, or political power in society, and so they are necessarily tied to trying to figure out how they work with adults. And then I think when we understand the nature of kind of youth development, a young folk need for a close, caring relationship with adults is a primary need of young folk, and youth organizing helps meet that. And for us, obviously, family is the unit of struggle, if you will, and how we think communities get changed. So it takes everybody.
Beautiful. I'm catching something I like here too, and that is we're often inviting youth into our adult spaces.
Right.
and you're saying the youth organizing is they allow us in, maybe. Every once in a while, which I think is great. I think that's right. They need that.
Yeah, I don't get to write on the flip chart anymore.
This is great. Talk to me a little bit. I mean, we're hearing so much in the news and in the media around school to prison, pipeline, and it's a buzzword, and everyone's talking about it, and we're getting all these statistics flowing now in many reports and books and so on. Concretely, as you organize around that concept, what does that mean? What do you think that looks like?
Woo! Gosh, it's a lot of things. I think
we've got time. We're good.
I mean, I think for us, most concretely, it looks like the set of practices and policies and procedures that move or push young people, particularly young people of color, out of school and into prison or criminal environments. I don't want to say environments like we just kind of throw them there, but the idea that young people are kind of systematically kind of pushed out of schools through a variety of factors. The most glaring one has been around school discipline, particularly around suspensions. But again, for us, school to prison pipeline has to do with funding, what schools get what, and what it's spent on. For some folk young folk in New Orleans, it's it's kind of the ambiance of when you walk into a school, you're greeted with metal detectors. One of our young people that we lost last year, a young man by the name of George Carter, he always imagined that schools would have mood detectors instead of metal detectors. And so this is the idea that kind of visually and then just kind of spiritually, as they walk into school, they're experiencing an incarceration-like experience from all over. So it is about kind of comprehensively changing how school is experienced for young folk, particularly, again, Black and brown youth in this country.
Right. So,
I think a good book to follow up and get Michelle Alexander does a much better job. She wrote a book about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You should check it out.
The new Jim Crow, and we've talked about that on a number of other of our webinars. And I think what I'm hearing there is again a whole approach saying, yeah, we want to look at specific discipline processes in specific schools and school districts, hopefully wide, but also we understand that this is structural. It has something to do with the distribution of resources, and it has something to do with legislation and how those decisions are being made and where they're being made and at what places in the system. And that's critical work. That's hard work. It takes a lot of analysis. It takes a lot of organizing.
Yeah, a lot of pizza.
Yeah, I bet. I can only imagine. Nice. If you could, I'm sure your work doesn't have sort of a whole lot of, how shall I say it? It's different every day, I'm imagining. But tell us a little bit about a snapshot of this work in some different places across the country represented in your alliance. I'm thinking of places like Chicago or Denver or New York City. Miami, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. I know I think you've got partners or alliance partners in all of those areas.
Yeah.
Any of those case studies you'd like to just take us through and give us a sense of what people are doing on the ground?
Sure. So I'll start in New York. So the Urban Youth Collaborative in New York, they just won a multi-million-dollar campaign for restorative justice in their schools. So now they are what we would say in the implementation phase. So they have monthly meetings. They're a collaborative of 4 youth organizing groups from across the city. And so for them, it looks like, meetings where now they're meeting with the Department of Education folk who are now helping to construct this department. Now they're playing a role of a critical ally. So they're at the table helping to shape and make decisions around how the restorative justice programs will be implemented. They're also on the ground in the schools, helping to survey students around restorative justice. Now they're in the process of also educating a lot of students around what restorative justice is and what it's supposed to be at. And then one of our partners, Sisters and Brothers United, they are actually in the process of training a cadre of young folk that will be certified in restorative justice so that they can actually be the practitioners who implement the restorative justice program in their high school. In Miami, they just won a promise around restorative justice. So now they're in the process of after school. They've been talking to different high schools and trying to find out where they can land their first restorative justice program. Part of what their work looks like now after school is that they're looking at the different programs and trying to figure out which one will best fit Miami and the conditions there. In Denver, Padres y Jovenes is working with the National Education Association to really figure out how to implement restorative justice citywide. So there you have young people, again, kind of getting learned up in restorative justice so that they can then facilitate workshops with teachers and other educational professionals in their school. And then also looking at some of the policy angles that they need to have in place in order to make sure restorative justice kind of really lands. So, and then in Philadelphia, it looks like a budget fight as they're undergoing massive cuts. Young people are fighting to make sure that restorative justice coordinators and restorative justice programs stay as part of the budget.
Nice. This is energizing for me to keep hearing this, because I think, sometimes, those of us who aren't careful, we can get stuck up in places where we're discussing, is this a movement or not? And what does it look like? And how can we measure a movement? And you guys are doing it on the ground. And that's what's incredible. And I think we have a lot to learn from how you're doing it and how you're organizing. And so I'm really jazzed by this conversation. Is there other things you want to add on that, Jonathan, around concepts of restorative justice? I mean, I know that, there's been this funny division between, not funny, but legitimate division between the sort of conceptual concepts of transformative justice, changing structures and institutions, then expecting when those change, people will change, and restorative justice, which has historically focused a lot on individual and interpersonal interactions. And yet some of us are saying we think those two need to be talking to each other and working much more closely together, and that in fact they speak to each other. They offer values and practices that bridge both of that work. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you feel about that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting and great creative tension, I think. For us, the personal is political. And then I came out of a youth development lens. So one of the stories we'd always tell was the story of the girl and the starfish, right? And she's on the beach and she's throwing starfish back. And the guy asks her, what is she doing? She says she's saving them. And he says, do you see all these starfish? You'll never get to all of them. Why don't you just stop? And then she keeps going and she throws one back. She says, will it matter to that one? And so I think that's some of the tension that's good, like until we create the kind of transformative justice that exists where everyone will have access to the resources that they need. There will continue to be a need for restorative justice to help address some of the roots and remedies to violence that we're having, but also having a kind of structural is to understand that oftentimes these acts are not isolated or individual acts, that they stem from structural inequalities. That it takes, that was, many years in creating and will take many years of organizing to undo. So I do think there's a really creative dance in terms of what we need now, and then also what we see in the future. And for youth organizing groups, there is a huge component that's now kind of emerging around healing. And I think we see restorative justice as part of that healing, right? That as young people are hurt by, endure educational trauma, restorative justice begins to be a way of a means of changing that. And also for us, it's also a way of building stronger relationships, political relationships between students and teachers, to really get them on the same page and really united around the same vision.
Cool. I want to build on that a little bit. Tell me a little bit about the role of teachers. I'm imagining we probably have educators in listening right now and wondering, what is our role? What's the role for teachers and educators in this process? How are they supporting, involved, engaged with with this youth organizing, student organizing?
Absolutely. Some of our partners include Teachers United in New York, as well as the Education for Liberation Network. We see teachers as a really valuable ally in this work in restorative justice. I think we're clear that it doesn't necessarily really serve the long-term interests of teachers to be suspending students. I don't think any teacher becomes a teacher with the ideal of mind, like, I'm going to go suspend everybody. That's what I want to do today. But we are clear that, again, there's a lot of structural inequalities that are created that exist in education that kind of exasperate the conditions. So we really see teachers in a really critical role. When I was doing youth organizing, I couldn't organize one student without the support of teachers who would open their classrooms to me and to young folk to make presentations. I think that's one way that teachers can do that, try to figure out who's doing restorative justice and invite them in to have a conversation. I think, advocating for other approaches to discipline. I think we're clear, at least, once a student is kind of sent out of class, that the suspension then becomes the call of the principal. Teachers should be, really challenging principals and school administrators to come up with another way. I think they should also, can also get in on the budget battles, right? That they're clear that most education is underfunded, and so we really need their voice at the table to say, to really speak to what it is that they need. And then I think, taking advantage of professional development opportunities, enrolling in a master's program at EMU, right, to really learn what restorative justice is, do some studying and some reading. I think there's a really great examples that teachers can look to and really figure out what role they want to play.
And talk to me a little bit about the union, teachers' unions. I mean, I can imagine that could be an adversarial role. They're doing their own organizing, they're choosing their own issues, and they're sort of doing. How's your relationship been with teachers' unions?
It's been an interesting one. I think if you had asked me that maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I might have clawed the screen and threw my computer. But I think the teachers' unions have taken some really huge steps in really acknowledging the role that they played in zero tolerance. Kind of been we're actually in a restorative justice process with them on some levels, as they've come to acknowledge the role that certain policy positions that they took around zero tolerance have had an impact, unintended consequences. So the work in Denver, again, is being driven by the NEA, which I think is really huge. They released a news article a couple of months ago, really claiming the school to prison pipeline and calling for its end and its dismantling. You had Randy just recently write some pieces to really challenge school discipline, and also acknowledge that they had taken kind of a broken windows approach to schooling with zero tolerance, and have acknowledged that. So I think we're in an opportunity, a moment of healing. AJ is also part of a national alliance called the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, which is comprised of the 2 teachers unions and the SEIU. So that has been a place to really to talk about that. We were excited when they part of their ESEA demands included a demand for restorative justice for $500 million. So we're really, really excited that they would call for that. We've also seen locally, like in San Francisco, where teachers unions were on one side of the table and youth and community groups were on the other side of the table around school discipline. They now have found themselves on both sides of the table and have been able to push some real critical school discipline wins in San Francisco. We've seen the same, similar in Philadelphia, particularly around the death around LaPortia Massey, right? And really calling teachers to really reflect and think about the impact of these budgets and really how they need to really step forward in this moment for young folk.
That's beautiful. Jonathan, maybe just, you said your alliance started in 2008, is that right?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about, I mean, are we on a wave here sort of with new media coverage and stuff? It's not that, I don't think this violence is new. I don't think any of us agree that, but we're getting new exposure. Are you feeling that in this whole process? What are some of the waves in this since 2008? Or have you been working sort of as the work seemed pretty steady from then on, and how has that morphed or changed?
Yeah. Yeah, I've had an old moment for there. Like, I remember when there wasn't an internet. Oh, but I do think the advent of social media has created an interesting level of heightened consciousness around these incidents. I think, again, what we saw in Colombia, like young folk from around the country knew that those kind of things happen in their schools. But now we're more aware, we're seeing it. And I think that has had an interesting effect in terms of us really thinking about what's happening. You know, the Obama administration and other folk, they don't talk about school to prison pipeline if it wasn't for the 20 plus years of young folk who have been organizing around it, really, you know, waging deep ideological struggle around its existence and really pushing folk to pay attention and take notice. So it has been a steady march, but I do think we're in a very interesting moment. Again, the last year or 2 years ago, the Department of Ed released federal guidelines on ending the school to prison pipeline. You had Arnie Duncan really championing the role of young folk and really calling, again, teachers and educators to really fulfill what it is that called them into teaching. So I think we're in, again, a very, very interesting moment to think about restorative justice and a lot of things, I think, even broader, right? Like what the future and direction of this country, and how do we walk out of this moment together?
And this is sort of a side, but I think it's important because I'm, you know, someone who teaches social movements and stuff. We know technology can be used incredibly powerfully. It can also actually speed the process up so fast sometimes that we lose control of the process. Yeah. You know? I mean, you know, so it's got its two sides. There's no question. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that probably scares me is as restorative justice becomes more popularized, that it loses some of its essence, right? And then it becomes just simply, let's sit on the floor in a circle and talk this stuff out, right? And not the kind of real conscious healing and transformation that has marked restorative justice. Yeah, we're with you on that one. Not that sitting in a circle on the floor isn't a good exercise.
Right. I sit on the ground in circles all the time.
I'm sure you do. Johonna, how do you envision the role of academics or academia in relation to this work and justice movements more generally? As someone who's been in the field, on the ground, on the front lines, and now in academia, how can you bring these things together? Do you mind talking a little bit to that, Johonna?
Sure. And my internet connection seems to be a little bit in and out, so hopefully you all can hear me well. I think one of the role is kind of one way I see my role is being someone who is a connector, right? So connecting people who may not all be in the same space, but are having conversations about similar things. So there are a number of people who define themselves as restorative justice scholars, restorative justice practitioners, but are not in any way aware of the leadership that young people of color in particular are providing in their schools and communities in this movement, the policies that they're actually creating that are in many ways creating jobs for these practitioners who don't know about the work, but then also young people need to be positioned for those positions. They have important analysis, important skills that they have and also need to be developed. So one of it's just creating these connections. I think that is an important role to play. And then another role would definitely be, I think, around the issues around kind of power and equity. So that relates to much more how I see my doing work rather than what I'm doing. So that means that rather than me maybe interviewing youth organizers and saying, this is my analysis of what they're doing, or my analysis of youth organizing, or my analysis of the school to prison pipeline in relation to their organizing, of much more lifting up their analysis and the work that they're doing, that young people as really at the forefront of kind of shaping how we think about these issues. And I just want to highlight one of those things, that Jonathan said earlier when he was talking about how young people are really, I think, broadening the ways in which we can think about restorative justice. Oftentimes when people think about restorative justice, we think about it in, as you mentioned earlier, Carl, in an interpersonal sense. So person A, steals something from person B, let's say it happens at school, we're shifting from those questions that the criminal justice system asks in terms of, what law was broken, who did it, and how should they be punished, to these restorative questions in terms of, well, who was harmed by that, who's responsible for fixing the harm, and then how do the affected parties, like those who are affected, really address the needs and repair the harms. Those questions are really important in terms of how we're thinking about restorative justice in terms of this approach to looking at harms that are done. But what Jonathan is talking about when he was talking about the analysis that young people are lifting up is when we're thinking about who's harmed, he's saying we don't need to only ask that question in relation to kind of students being the harms or the harm doers, that we need to move, like young people are actually moving those questions to apply to the school, the institutions itself. So who's harmed? In a large sense, students are harmed by the ways in which schools are structured. Oftentimes they're harmed by these policies. And then who's responsible for fixing the harm? They, in many ways, are taking on the responsibility, but they're also calling on policymakers to take on the responsibility. They're calling on educators to take on some responsibility. And then they're also developing really collaborative ways that people can all participate in repairing those harms, whether we're talking about, he named earlier, the facilities, the school facilities, and how are young people harmed when their schools are falling apart, or how are young people harmed when even outside of the school there's no healthy places to get food to eat. What Jonathan is saying that young people are doing is saying that these two are restorative justice issues, and this too is part of restorative justice because this is part of the harm that we are addressing. And I think that's really important. So I see part of my role and part of the role I think that those of us can play who have a kind of access to, are seen as people of authority, expertise, and really access, to make our voices heard, is to really lift up the voices of people who often don't have that access and really center their analysis and the work that they're doing.
Thanks, Johonna. Very nicely put. And I think that's the crux of the matter. And that's what excites me about it, because we're starting to see new applications all over the place, and that's very encouraging. Maybe you've said some of this already. Maybe you want to comment some more on what do you think? What are the lessons that we can be learning from this movement, if you will, and youth organizing and this particular understanding of restorative justice and racial justice? What are some of the things that, let's say, someone who's been doing traditional restorative justice work, maybe in one program, in one place, one particular practice, which is fantastic. We need those folks doing it. I'm not in any way minimizing that work, but saying, what do we learn from each other in this conversation? What can we learn from each other in this conversation?
I'll say a few things, and I know Jonathan has a lot to say about this too. So I think definitely one core lesson from the work of youth organizers and intergenerational organizing, community organizing in general, is that those who are really at the brunt of kind of on the receiving end of these school discipline policies, of kind of inequities in school, those who are most impacted should be at the forefront of the change and are at the forefront. And so therefore that means that if others of us who are in those discussions, we should make sure that we're always engaging and looking to those most impacted as the leaders. I think that's a really important lesson. And so, for example, for me, it means that rather than even assume that I know what role I should be playing in this work, is that I need to consult with the organizations, with youth organizers, and say, what role would be most helpful for me to play, and then look at that in terms of my own capacity and my skills. I think that's important. Looking at those most impacted are the leaders, and we need to recognize that as such. I think another important lesson, and this is actually something that Jonathan and I have talked a lot about, and it's come from also the work around, even before we get to not only the work around the school to prison pipeline, but just in terms of juvenile justice policies, as young people really early on in not only organizing against zero tolerance policies in schools, but even just this a barrage of policies aimed at incarcerating young people, named those policies and practices, including the increasing police presence in their neighborhoods, as a war on youth. And in doing that, they therefore recognize these things as violence against youth, really shifting the conversation around youth and violence. And that is important because oftentimes when people think about youth violence, particularly when they're thinking about Black and brown young people in violence, they are constantly thinking about young people as the perpetrators of violence. And therefore they leave out structural violence, state-sponsored violence like police violence, and then depend upon those same forms of violence as if they're ending it, passing more get tough on crime policies that are furthering more violence, and actually addressing the root causes of interpersonal violence. And that's why restorative justice and transformative justice is so important. And so again, the lesson here is that we need to rethink what we count as violence, and really broaden what we count as violence. And Jonathan, I know that you probably want to kind of speak to that as well.
No, you hit it right on the head. You got it. That was awesome. I was taking notes.
Jonathan, you want to jump in on anything there?
No, I think she Johonna hit it right on the head. I think again, for young folk, the youth organizing work is for them. I think they're beginning to understand, or I'm beginning to understand their work as part of a peace and justice movement, to really, like Johonna said, to end the war on young folk. And that is the broad set of things that kind of challenge young people's growth and development, and in some cases take their lives. And again, for them, restorative justice seems almost like just the right to live, the right to grow, the right to blossom.
That's right. That's right. So there's some challenging, radical. I love it. The framing, though, war on youth. I mean, we've had so many other wars on drugs, wars on the war on whatever, that come from the top and come from the legislators or those in thinking about this in power. But I think we're seizing. What I'm sensing from the youth organizing that's going on here is we're seizing a moment to reframe some of this and use another language, and I think that's critical. We know in social movements, sort of what are the three pillars of political opportunity, which is clearly here, resource mobilization, which you're clearly interested in doing and are doing, as we see in New York City and DC, and framing the message.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's making this movement so successful, I think, and so impressive.
I think another lesson would definitely be, a couple. I think one is with rather than for. So when we often talk about even just restorative justice in a disciplinary framework, we talk about kind of restorative discipline. What does it mean if someone's done something wrong, and you're rather than doing something to them or for them, we're going to do something with them. We're going to engage that person. And I think that it's very similar with this youth organizing work. It's saying that as whether it's adults or professionals or practitioners or educators, rather than saying we're going to design a program for youth, we're going to do it with, and then also support work that's led by young people. And I think that that's important when we think about program design and program development. What does it mean to cultivate leadership? Youth. What does it mean to cultivate youth-led work? I think that's really critical. So I guess in terms of kind of just some steps of what that might look like for somebody that's interested in doing that is starting with, what are the issues that young people care about? What's important to them? I think that would be a really good way to start, and looking at it, just kind of approaches to building youth leadership, whether it's even, whether it's starting off with something, you mentioned circle processes earlier, but how do you actually, support young people in leading, even when you're having something like that, rather than adults leading that work.
Right. Nice. Good. Hey, we've got some other panelists on here, I think, too, and I don't know if they're interested in jumping in here, but I'd invite some other voices in here if they're interested. Jonathan, I don't know if you want to invite anyone into the conversation, or Johonna?
I think Chino Harden is on.
Yes. Chino, I'm seeing here, I think, and who else do we have on here? We'd love to hear some voices coming in from outside, and if you want to jump in, I just want to say on the Q&A, we've got 5-6 great questions. We're gonna go at them. We've got time. We'd love more questions because I think we'd like to get this conversation going. So please, for those who are out there listening and engaged with this webinar, send us in your questions. What's making sense to you? It doesn't have to be a question. It could be a comment. We'll try to read that also. What are your concerns? What are your pushbacks? What are your praises? Let's hear from you. Chino, what would you like to say in this conversation? Is it going to be just through chat, or are we going to be able to get some vocal in here? We might not be able to get something vocal in here. Maybe I'm pushing technology too far here.
We are, let me see here. Well, I guess I'll just say something about Chino, who I first met through the Prison Moratorium Project.
Okay.
I don't know the organization now. Did we get? Not yet. We're still working on it. But I think that this kind of a number of people have started off, and now is at the Center for New Leadership, I think. But I think a number of people have started off in terms of organizing in a reactive approach, meaning what are we organizing against, and then we're kind of now shifted, what are we organizing for, and how do we actually create alternatives within our communities rather than just kind of knocking things down but building things up. So you can take it from there, Tina.
Hey, yes, I'm actually here with 2 young people that's in the program that we run here, and some of the major questions they have is just getting a grasp on what restorative justice is. And I think we've been talking about it in the context of organizationally, institutionally, but I think in my understanding, you guys can jump in anytime you get ready. I think they're asking it from more of a personal place of what restorative justice is to them, in efforts, I think, to kind of understand how it can and should play out institutionally, organizationally, and things like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Now I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. Jonathan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's a very great question. I don't know if there's one singular answer to that question, But I do think for me and how I see it, I do think it is about our commitment to peace and justice that is embodied and then gets lived through restorative justice practices. So again, it can be, I think for us, Naya Kinney, the young woman who recorded the incident in Columbia, South Carolina, we see that as an act of restorative justice. She saw an injustice happening and she instinctively acted. So it is kind of living out King's words and understanding that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And how are we being peace warriors in that moment that we're committed to helping resolve, that are transforming that conflict into an opportunity to grow and to develop. So for me, that's what it is. And you can live that. I think that's some of the beauty around restorative justice. You don't necessarily need a whole lot to practice it because it can be kind of a philosophy or a way of life that again tries to seek peace and justice and kind of really non-harm, non-hurt. And I think when we can move that, then for us, we say at AJ, then you're waging love. And so we feel like that's the daily task of our youth organizers, is to wage love.
That's cool.
So your question is around just kind of what does it look like in an organization? Could you say it again?
Yeah, what does it look like? I was saying what it would look, I asked what it would look like interpersonally. I think Jonathan kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of like a philosophy, something that you kind of build into yourself, you know, deeper than a mantra, but, you know, definitely a philosophy that you practice interpersonally through whatever relationships. I guess I'm also, you know, because Jonathan, you mentioned the healing piece and you said that was coming up a lot more. And for the work that we do here, I run a youth program for young people ages 16 to 24. It's a mentoring program. So we talk about things like that, you know, from time to time, especially when we're talking about conflict through the interperson and like, you know, educational conflict, all the things that you guys talked about earlier in terms of like zero tolerance, being pushed out, like these kind of things. So I think that's very helpful for that. I'm just trying to see to understand what it looks like for organization to start to practice restorative justice. And maybe I'm thinking maybe the healing and reconciliation comes first, or maybe these are kind of like play out simultaneously at each other. You know what I'm saying? Maybe I need to bring somebody here and do a training. I don't know what it kind of looks like, but those are the things that were like off the top of my head.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really great question. For me, I would like look at the kind of the rules that govern the space. What role do young people get to play? What happens when something happens in the group? Do young people get kicked out for the day? Do we have a conversation? I think what you'll find is that your good programs, good youth development programs almost have a restorative justice quality to them, almost embedded in it naturally, right? Just this understanding that young people are in the process of developing and growing, and that every moment, everything can be used to further that. And I think, you know, that's, again, some of the challenge and the response of restorative justice. So I think, yeah, I think it is approaching that conversation almost kind of, I would even, you know, maybe do some kind of activity where you kind of draw up some of the scenarios or ask them to create some of the scenarios or conflicts that they've seen in the that they've seen it come up in the center, and how they've seen it handled and how they would like it handled, right? And I think that begins the conversation around restorative justice on a very concrete level. It can get very esoteric, but it has to live and be really concrete for young folk.
Right. And then, you know, we're at CNUS, used to be Prison Moratorium Project. So we just changed our names. But, you know, we're launching an arrest diversion program, and it's kind of the first of its kind in New York, and on a level of like, it's not coming from NYPD, it's coming from the community. And we haven't even launched the beta version yet. So we're in the beginning stages. So what we're doing is a whole series of like community consultations, really getting the buy-in and support, and also having their opinion be reflected in how the program runs. And it's funny because, you know, as I'm listening to you guys, I was like, wow, it seems like it's very set institutionally, like I said again, in terms of like schools and things like that. But and as I'm listening to you, I was like, wow, this is part and parcel, in my opinion, a beginning to a restorative justice program that is connected in the community. So the arrest diversion program, what it would do, have we get it off the ground and have it our way, is that instead of a young person getting fingerprinted and arrested, they will be diverted here, definitely willingly. There's nothing holding them there. We're not trying to widen the net. But they will be diverted here to be taken into our program, right? So our program would be connected with, you know, clergy, community board members, a lot of different stakeholders, even block associations, and like, you know, and when they leave here, they will be a community justice ambassador. So their job will be to go out and kind of spread what they've learned, you know, throughout their community and practice those skills and whatnot. So I think it's interesting to think about restorative justice and a model that can be implemented with young people on the intergenerational piece that we was kind of talking about, but in a concrete, and not in a concrete way, but in a kind of way that like has an impact throughout the whole community, even in dealing with the NYPD officers who are, you know, tend to be racist and targeting and things like that. You know what I'm saying?
No, that's it. I think
go ahead, Jonathan.
oh, sorry, I'm dominating. Go ahead, Johonna, jump in.
No.
No, I think for us, like that, for youth organizing, like that's the kind of program that we fight for, that we fight to make policy, right? That we fight and organize to make sure that it's rightly resourced. When communities talk about community control, again, in this moment of Black Lives Matter, right? I think what you're talking about in the program that you're talking, I think that is, for a lot of youth groups, they would be like, yes, this is what we want. And I think, again, the kernel of that, that transformation, that we take someone who seems to be at odds with society and transform them into an aid, as someone who can now facilitate justice, I think is a beautiful vision. And yeah, I think absolutely. I think, again, it's that dynamic, right? Like how do you take that program to scale? And it's, you know, for us youth organizing, it's like, yo, our resources, our tax dollars should go into those type of programs and to support communities in that kind of way.
Absolutely.
Johonna.
I was just gonna say that I think, Chino, when you were talking about, I think you reflected this essence of it being about the values, right? Like what values are grounding. I think, Jonathan, you spoke to this too. What values are really shaping responses, what values are shaping the work. And I think that is really essential, that you all really kind of, so to speak, hit the nail on the head, because, well, you know, a lot of us, when we talk about restorative justice, we say it's not a practice, it's not a program, you know, like Jonathan said, it is a philosophy, you know, it is an approach. It's in so many ways, it's a mindset. When I was a high school teacher, you know, I found myself more and more getting wrapped up in thinking about, you know, how can I keep my students from breaking these rules in my classroom, and less from just like relating to them. And I had to really return to that relational mindset that I had more when I was involved with young people outside of a formal classroom. You know, what does it mean when a young person is, you know, quote unquote, disrupting my classroom, for me to say, you know, what's going on? How was your day to day, or what your needs are? And so that didn't come out through a program I was implementing in classroom, but really my own mindset had to shape, you know, how I engage with young people. And I think that, you know, kind of even at the interpersonal level, and that's definitely the case, I think at the structural level at all, how do we have this mindset of dealing with, of really looking at what are the root causes, and how do we address those root causes collectively? How do we meet our needs?
Right. We've got some great questions going on here, and I just want to thank you. And I'd like, Chino, for you to stay on, and everyone to help jump in answering some of these. But I think I'll turn to some of these questions, if that's okay. Starting off with someone who's asked, what are some of the best ways to begin a restorative justice group for teens?
Pizza.
Anyone want to jump in there and say a few things like, hey, this is you need to think this would be a must, or this is not, or you know, think about this, or where do you start? I guess is what the question's asking. How would we begin the conversation?
I guess the question is it in school or out of school? Because that also will shape some of the answer.
Sure. So whoever's behind the question, help us jump in there with a little bit more detail, and we'll jump into answering that question. Let me move on quickly here to look at some of these things. Can you speak? Here's an interesting question to what is happening with girls and restorative justice. Like, is restorative justice being used effectively with all teens, all youth? And is there special programs for girls, for guys? And is there special needs? And how is RJ being applied?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting conversation, or again, moment that we are in. Through the Alliance, I sit at part of the youth table on the Boys and Men of Color for my Brother's Keeper Alliance. There was definitely pushback from our sisters around their role in centrality and making sure that they get justice or included. I'm really encouraged by the work coming out of Power U in Miami, who have really taken up kind of Black Girls Matters and really focusing on Black girls as part of their call, and have really produced a really good thinking around and writing around it. But I think overall, my survey is that it is somewhat of an emerging field. I think before, at least when I was first doing it, like when they would talk about young ladies, they would talk about an etiquette program, right? That they just needed to learn how to be ladies, and that would solve the problem. I think we're out of that moment. I think that we've been able to really lift the ceiling and really talk about what restorative justice can look like for Black girls and brown girls in schools, given particularly the impact that the school to prison pipeline has on them. I do see some growing edges, particularly around preschool, because I think that's where we see the highest rates of suspensions and push out for Black girls. Is in preschool, and then kind of, I think you can look at a lot of different ways and programs to really address it.
Mm-hmm.
I think another thing just related to kind of gender justice, specifically in connection with racial justice, is that's really helpful is when we're thinking about the root causes of gender-based violence. So when we're thinking about, for example, just whether it's sexual violence, whether there's even sexual harassment that happens like in school, or whether it's dating violence. And then we need to understand the ways in which young men are socialized, like writ large, like how are young men socialized in our society? And then therefore that really helps us to think about, again, how do we involve people in addressing the root causes of harm that occurs? And I think really a lot of this, it broadens beyond what people generally think of as restorative justice, and is more closely related to what many people think of as transformative justice, which is how do we transform these systems of oppression that are at the root causes. And so, for example, that means that in a school, you might have I think Sisters and Brothers United does a lot of this work really, really well in New York, right? I think that they have done some work around how do we educate people around a different story of masculinity, like rather than saying that strong men are violent, how do we actually learn something different? And that's a part of the program, or that's a part of the education that's happening. And what does that look like when we're also involving women and girls in that? There's a group in Chicago, I'm trying to think of the name of the group right now, the Rogers Park Young Women's Action Team, and they've done some really amazing work. They really use a framework of community accountability. How do we involve our community members in holding one another accountable for and increasing safety, particularly when we're thinking about safety of women and girls of color? And so they actually did a campaign where they involved young men as leaders in that work.
Mm-hmm.
That's exciting. Yeah, and going back to Miami, they did a town hall around Black girls and school discipline. They were expecting 100 folks, 700 people turned out for the town hall. They went almost 3 hours over just hearing story upon story of kind of the educational trauma, some of the community trauma that have impacted Black girls and how it has played out in the classroom. So I do, again, just want to echo, it is a very, very, very important issue. And I think it's, again, something that is not beyond the means for restorative justice to begin to help remedy.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Just heard back from the original question that I started off with, Dawn, and she says she's thinking about RJ for teens in community-based programs outside of schools. Where would we start in trying to start a group or start a conversation outside of the schools in a community situation? And I'm gonna let anyone jump in who thinks, want to say something to Dawn on that.
I would think it's important when you're thinking about restorative justice and transformative justice and healing and things like that, especially with young people. I think the first starting platform should be leadership development. And I think really concentrating on leadership development with our young people, making sure that they have the tools to build the analysis around the issues that they're facing and what that really looks like, would lead in quite naturally to what restorative justice means and how to break that down. I think there's many ways to go about restorative justice. There's a lot of different organizations that do different things that look similar to what we're talking about and also look very different. Some people use restorative justice as a framework, and really what they're talking about is conflict resolution. So I mean, there's a lot of different ways to kind of approach that. So I think it really is about your populace and who you're serving and what the issues are, and developing them in the wholeness of their humanity as a young person and what that really looks like, and helping them develop their analysis to not combat it, but to understand it. Because I think a lot of young people, and I know for a fact when I was young, I was angry, and I can definitely say, oh, it was the cops, but it wasn't just the cops. It was like a systematic, systemic way of where we were oppressed in my neighborhood. And that played out through cops, that played out through schools, that played out through homophobia, that played out through sexism, it played out through all of these different veins and facets. I think giving young people the lenses in which to understand that, and then the vocabulary in which to articulate that, will be the first step, just doing justice for them before we can even kind of get to the restorative part. And that's just my opinion.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Gina. Thanks. There's a number of resource questions here that I think, let me take now. Sometimes we wait for the very end, and maybe we can just answer those fairly quickly. Anyone jumping in, what resources do you recommend for adults interested in learning relevant skills?
Looking at my bookshelf.
Anything jumping out to you, or a good read just to get an adult immersed into what's happening in this movement and how they could become more versed in it?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Are there resources you'd recommend for adults interested in learning relevant skills to find out, what's going on here? Are there resources you'd recommend? Websites, something to read?
Relevant skills into youth organizing, or relevant skills into? I'm
not exactly sure how Naomi is putting it here. She just says, what resources do you recommend for adults interested in learning relevant skills?
Well, if I think it's relevant skills for like organizing, and like breaking and understanding oppression. Actually, the Soul School based out in Oakland does a really good oppression training. Mm-hmm. I'm really blanking on what the name is, but Soul just power. Yep, exactly.
School of Unity and Liberation in Oakland.
Yes, exactly. So they do a really good training. I know they work with folks in terms of like their pricing, but they definitely require like sponsorship to like bring them out there. So they're good as a resource depending on what your budget is, and if you're able to kind of like get them to come give you the training. They also leave you with lots of materials that you can work through, and lots of materials that you can end up using later and facilitating different groups with your young people. I will also say the Anti-Violence Project. They do a lot of good training and work around violence and restorative justice and what that kind of looks like for young people. They have a manual that you can get that has a lot of different interactive exercises and things like that. Of course, the Center for New Leadership, you can always hit us up. I'm C. Harden at centerfornewleadership.org. It's NU, not NEW. And yeah, I'm sure you guys know tons of folks as well.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you want to add? Others on the panel?
Jonathan, you want to go first?
No, I think y'all got something coming up over the summer, right? Alley-oop.
Yeah, so a couple of things in terms of restorative justice specifically. We have a course that I'm actually co-teaching this summer, and you'll hear more about it in the announcements, just around foundations of restorative justice. I think it's really important not only to think about restorative justice in terms of skills, but really also the analysis, the consciousness piece. It's not just about concrete skills, although skills are important. There is also, in terms of skills, a practice, a skills-based course, which is on circle processes that will be offered in February here. It's over a 1 weekend here in Harrisonburg, Virginia. It's just in the Shenandoah Valley. It's mountains. It's very beautiful here. So you should definitely, it will be a great opportunity to come to take that. And then also I'm teaching an online course, and you'll hear more about this in the announcements as well in the fall, Foundations of Restorative Justice. Just kind of looking at the philosophy, the values, some kind of models of practice. The Zehr Institute has a number of resources as well. But in terms of youth organizing, I would say, I guess this also gets into the resource question a bit, Carl. There are Funders Collaborative on youth organizing. The website is fcyo.org. So for those of you who would just like to learn more about youth organizing, what it means, and the different things that young people are organizing around, how do you build a youth leadership? They have an occasional paper series. If you go to that website, you check out resources, you can read about youth organizing. In terms of a couple of works on restorative justice, I'll just share a few. One, and now I'm going to do some commercials for people that I don't really, they didn't pay me to do this. You can't see this opposite. Anyway, this book, this book is called Circle in the Square, Building Community and Repairing Harm in School. It's not necessarily about restorative justice and youth leadership, but it does give some different ways of connecting with restorative practices in schools. One that I really do like that does more kind of with youth leadership is this one, Peacemaking Circles in Urban Youth Bringing Justice Home, by Carolyn Boyce Watson. It really tells a story of a youth organization in Boston that really used circles for leadership development, for healing, circles as a restorative justice practice. And then this book here by Sean Ginwright, Black Youth Rising, it's not actually about restorative justice per se. The subtitle is Activism and Radical Healing in Urban America. But what this book really does well is it talks about youth development organizations and urban communities, and the role that plays in really developing youth leadership, and also as a space for what he calls radical healing, how actually activism and organizing does support young people healing from the trauma that they often experience through structural violence.
Nice. Jonathan, you want to add anything on that?
I mean, I think you kind of get it through observation and participation. I think folk can follow the work of the Alliance. They wanted to see it kind of in action, but I think the resources that have been laid out so far have been really good. I would definitely check in at the FCYO, particularly look at their occasional papers where they saw kind of laid out a very interesting continuum around youth service to kind of youth organizing, so folk can get a sense of how they all blend together and really work for community and personal change. And then also there's some pieces around kind of how youth organizing has developed across the different regions, which I think is, as a youth organizing buff, I think is a just very interesting read.
Yeah.
Great. Jonathan, can you give the Alliance's website, just so someone just asked, what is the Alliance's website?
Oh, it's allianceforeducationjustice.org.
And that's a number 4?
Yes. Let me confirm. I will just punch it up here. This is really bad. I only know the Twitter and the other one. But we're also online at For Ed Justice, and that is the number 4 Ed Justice, and then also on Facebook. That's probably where the action happens. The website tends to be, except for the blog where we do some laying out some stuff.
That's great. We had another viewer just asking similar. I hope they've been resourced a bit with some of the suggestions out here. They said, do you and Johonna have favorite text books, resources that you refer to feel grounded in practice? And I think you've talked to some of that. But if you're thinking of others along the way, jump in. This person was saying, Jonathan, I appreciate you bringing up that RJ gets trendy or trendier. It is possible to get it diluted and lose its healing essence. So they're asking about books to keep themselves grounded in the practice. Feel free to jump in on that. I'm going to grab a few more comments here that I'm seeing from the chat line. Someone's here, Jan, she's talking about, I'm continually defining RJ to others. And she's saying, not everyone's clearly familiar with it. How can we as citizens or as supporters of RJ become more involved in spreading the word? Interesting. Are there places where, you know, we can spread the word other than on our individual connections and networks that can amplify and multiply getting the word out about restorative justice? Are there platforms for that? Where are the loud hailers, the megaphones for talking about getting the word out about RJ?
One thing that comes to my mind immediately is somewhat connected to, I think, what Jonathan was talking about earlier in terms of how do we be the change we want to see. So in our everyday, one way, just in terms of in our everyday relationships, in our families, in the organizations that we work in, how are we actually using a restorative and transformative approach?
Mm-hmm. That's nice. Another great question.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think yeah. No, go ahead.
No, do you want to add? Please, jump in.
No, I was just going to echo what Johonna said, that it is, that is deeply personal. You should look at, like, does your church practice restorative justice? You know, are you practicing restorative justice with your partner, with your children? Just kind of all, kind of everything restorative justice. And even as events happen, just kind of being able to interject and say, restorative justice, we might have had a different outcome with this if we had gone a different way. I think probably the hardest though is when restorative justice, as it was created, when there is deep interpersonal violence that has happened between folk, and how do you again kind of do that? But I do think we have to kind of go out and profess it. As a country, as a world, it seems like we're coming out of a very punitive stage. And we just as Ella Baker said, give light and the people will find a way.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Here's another great question. How does the message of restorative justice become more normative and not left on the periphery as another component of the race dialogue and thus dismissed before given a legitimate ear? How do we get this into, to become something that's not just on the side or idealistic, or, how can we center this in the conversation, I think is what's being asked here. Second part, how do the terms restorative justice and other terms become part of the lexicon so that those who are aware that the current system has failed are equipped with the vocabulary, the language to discuss these alternatives? Anyone want to jump in on that?
I guess go ahead,
John. I would dare to say that it's actually kind of. Oh, go ahead, Johonna. Johonna.
Okay, so I'll start, and then you can continue with it. So, in terms of the question around what does it mean to center it? I think that one way that people have done that really well, restorative and transformative justice, is through whose experience we're centering. And so, you know, I think the work of Insight Women of Color Against Violence has been really instrumental, you know, to my own thinking, and saying that when we center the experiences of women who are at the receiving end of state-sponsored violence, mass incarceration, this deportation, and then also who are on the receiving end of oftentimes interpersonal violence. Therefore, it shows us that we have to use other approaches that don't depend upon the criminal legal system. So transformative justice approaches, community accountability has come about, really that attention through who we center. And then when we center, again, talking about youth leadership, the experiences of young people of color, you know, in schools and in their communities, it then helps us when we center their experiences. I think that it helps us to look at the necessity for these approaches to justice that don't depend upon, you know, locking people up and young people being slammed on the floor, because we know that that's not justice and it's not safety.
Jonathan, anything you wanted to add on that?
No, this is why I try to jump in before Johonna, because she says it way better than I could have ever said it. What Johonna said. But I do think it is that reverse, that centering, because when we see restorative justice work, and it works in white communities for white kids. I think one of the things that I was as we were fighting around it, to learn that, like, Fairfax County has a whole restorative justice system that begins in elementary school, that goes all the way through high school and extends to the juvenile justice system and how they handle it. And so for me, that is part of the possible. And again, we know it works for young folk and for communities, and it should be something that, it's a question of justice that makes it accessible for everybody. And at least for us around school discipline, like the stats, the data is just there. You can't, it's really hard to argue with, Black children being expelled or pushed out or suspended 3 times as much for white students for the same offenses. We have to have a different answer than that, and beyond just don't suspend them, right? We really need to figure out restorative justice, and like Johonna said, it's also about figuring out how we mitigate and remedies the state violence that is often core in young people's lives, particularly those who are locked out of access to power and equity.
Hey, it's hard to believe we're up to the last 5 minutes. This has been a rich conversation, and I'm really appreciating everyone that joined in. Chino and Johonna, Jonathan, and all the rest who were putting in some of the questions. And if we didn't get to exact of your questions, we'd like to make sure that you can be in touch with any of us that are involved in this conversation and the resources that were put out there. Let me just say thank you to the panelists, and I really appreciate the depth and the richness in which we took this conversation, and I'm hoping that those who participated are being able to glean from the tremendous work of youth organizing that's happening across this country. One of the beautiful things about this conversation is the hopeful nature of this. This gives a lot of hope for what's happening across the country. We get a lot of the bad news in the media all the time, and it's really great to see what young people are doing across this country. So thanks for all of you who are playing a part in enabling and facilitating that process. Appreciate it. I'm going to turn this over to Jordan, and he's going to take us through a little bit of the last bit of announcements, and then we'll close this wonderful conversation up in a few moments. Jordan.
Thank you, Carl. My name is Jordan Detweiler-Michelson, and I'm currently a graduate student at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. And I work as the graduate assistant to the Zehr Institute, and have a couple of short announcements regarding the Zehr Institute and upcoming events. And just real quick, I want to point out that a lot of resources were shared during the webinar, and a couple of you were typing in these resources or providing links, and I tried to condense that and put it all in one spot and dropped it into the chat window. So those resources are available for your reference. The goal of the Zehr Institute is to spread knowledge about restorative justice and to be a resource to practitioners while facilitating conversations and cultivating connections through activities like conferences and webinars. And we offer this space to explore frontier topics like the intersection of arts and peace building and the ways that trauma and restorative justice are connected. If you enjoyed today's conversation and you want to stay involved in discussing these and other topics around restorative justice, we've had an exciting lineup of RJ webinars this fall, and we would love for you to join us for the remaining webinars. We have one in December with Lauren Abramson. She's going to be talking about her practice that she's involved in Baltimore and her 18 years of community conferencing in that city. In February, we're going to be back and joined by David Karp and Karen Williamson on the topic of restorative approaches to sexual assault on college campuses. Both of these webinars take place on Wednesdays at 4:30 Eastern Time. And you can also view recordings of previous webinars, including this one, online at our website. We have a very, very exciting announcement with the Zehr Institute and Summer Peacebuilding Institute. Are very excited about our upcoming conference, Restorative Justice in Motion, Building a Movement. And the goal of this conference is to continue to explore our joint roles in building a global restorative justice movement. Together we'll be imagining the transformative power of restorative justice at the intersections of social and political change in our societies. So please come join us June 14th through the 17th. We invite you to submit proposals for workshops, seminars, panel presentations to take place at the conference, and the deadline for proposals is December 16th. So please come out for that, and please join us. We'd love to have you. The Summer Peacebuilding Institute will be offering 2 courses that incorporate or focus on restorative justice principles or ideas, theories, or practices. One, the Foundations of Restorative Justice, will take place May 30th to June 3rd. And then there will be a course focusing on truth-telling, reconciliation, and restorative justice from June 6th to June 10th. The Summer Peacebuilding Institute, for those of you who are not familiar, are kind of week-long intensive seminar courses. They can be taken for graduate credit. They can also just be taken for supplemental training and knowledge building. It's a really, really great opportunity to dive deep into some of this material and make connections with other practitioners who are working in these areas or dipping their toes in these areas and getting more information. As Johonna mentioned, we also are going to be offering a course online in the fall of 2016, the Foundations of Restorative Justice. If you're interested, then please email Sarah Rothshank at the email address provided here. And go ahead and mention this webinar. We would love to beam you in from wherever you may be, and you'd be able to participate in this course and learn more. Or if you have friends that would like to learn more and would participate in this course, then please share that with them. An announcement about one of our other programs, the Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, is a research-based training program that began in 2001. STAR brings together theory and practices from a wide variety of disciplines: neurobiology, conflict transformation, human security, spirituality, and restorative justice to address the needs of trauma-impacted individuals and communities. And this program is really great for individuals or organizations whose work brings them into contact with populations dealing with current or historic trauma. And there are several opportunities to receive STAR training. So keep an eye out for those. We have Level 1 training available in February and in May. And Level 2 training will be available in May 2016 and about this time next year, November 2016. More dates will be available as they become available on our website online. We have, here at the Center for Justice and Peace Building, we offer a graduate certificate in restorative justice, which allows working professionals to continue working while also complementing or completing their studies. It's a program to help practitioners reflect on their work and increase their knowledge and skills. You would be able to participate either on campus or through the online course, for example, that will be running next fall. So look for opportunities if you have interest in that. We'd love to have you. We are also offering a restorative justice in education training as a concentration in the full MA program here, the MA in education, or also as a graduate certificate with a 15-hour certificate program. So lots of ways to look for and find more information about restorative justice, because I know there was a lot of interest in that today. These might be areas that you could potentially tap into. The Center for Justice and Peace Building is a full master's program. It offers a master's in conflict transformation. It's a practice-based curriculum exploring nonviolent and restorative responses to conflict. So a lot of focus on some of the topics that we've talked about today, restorative justice, but also psychosocial trauma, strategic peace building, community development. It's a reflective and value-based practice and critical self-reflection experience. Very, very positive. And lastly, the Center for Justice and Peace Building and the Zehr Institute for Restorative Justice are both part of Eastern Mennonite University, which is located in Harrisonburg, Virginia, as Johonna and others have mentioned. It's beautiful here. And Eastern Mennonite University offers undergraduate degrees and several graduate degree programs, such as the MA in Conflict Transformation, MA in Education, Business Administration, Counseling, and Biomedicine. EMU also has a seminary program and is the host of the Summer Peace Building Institute. So you can learn more about all of our programs at emu.edu. Lastly, please check in at our website. We do list a lot of resources, the Little Book series, news articles, other publications. People are writing about restorative justice or making connections across disciplines. So please come to the website and check out the resources that are available there. Be updated on webinars that are coming up and events such as the conference that will be coming up in the summer. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Carl, who will close our time together.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you again, panelists Jonathan, Johonna, for your time. You're busy people, I know that, and we just want to thank you and lift up your arms as you continue this incredible work, and hope that this conversation will continue. This has been a pleasure. So thank you for everyone who's been with us for the seminar and the webinar, and we look forward to having you back for the next webinar. Have a good evening.
Thanks so much, Carl. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.